a trigger warning. We are going to be exploring some topics in this conversation which may be quite triggering, and so make sure that you are listening in a space that it feels safe, and that at any point, feel free to pause the video or take a break if you do feel like it is becoming a bit too much. Otherwise, thank you for listening. Hi everyone, my name is Elsie and I'm the founder of a platform called ourppls. And today we are bringing you another episode of the Heart Conversations, our Heart Conversations, speaking about topics that are important to us as a community and hopefully shedding light in a way that's culturally sensitive, but also relevant and meaningful. And today we're going to be speaking about a topic that's really dear to my heart. We are going to be speaking about sexual abuse and child sexual exploitation. Sorry. Okay. Today we're going to, okay. Today we're going to be speaking. No, I'm laughing. I shouldn't be laughing. Okay. Today we're going to be speaking about a topic that's really dear to my heart. Okay.
Take a moment. Take a few seconds.
And remember,
blow it all out.
Yeah, and remember your smile. It's not. I mean, maybe you can bring that in as well.
Yeah.
Later to explain your nerves about that particular topic.
Yeah.
Because that is something that triggers you.
Yeah.
And you do smile with it.
Yeah.
Maybe you can bring that into your intro.
Yeah.
Okay.
And smiling doesn't take away from the seriousness of it
Yeah.
either. But you can also say, this is a way that I'm discharging my energy because it's a sensitive topic.
Yeah.
Put it in your intro.
Okay.
And just take your time.
Hi everyone, my name is Elsie Ayotunde Cullen and I'm the founder of a platform called ourppls. And today we have another episode of Our People's Heart Conversations where we explore topics that are important to us as a community. And today we're going to be speaking about a topic that's really dear to my heart. We're speaking about child sexual exploitation and sexual abuse. There are many stats, especially in the UK, reporting on the impact of sexual abuse and the prevalence of it in our society. I think 1 in 4 women have experienced sexual abuse before the age of 16 or by the age of 16. I think it's 1 in 6 children and I think 1 in 16 men, something around those numbers. And I think it's just a widely experienced phenomenon, not only in this country, but I think, it happens worldwide. And the prevalence thereof, I think we still don't really understand how much it happens in our society. And oftentimes, because we don't speak about it, people don't realize the impact that it has, but also, like I said, the prevalence of it in our society. And today I have 2 amazing guests with me who I think have been so impactful for me again in my journey navigating this topic. And we'll get into like how your journey is intertwined with mine and how we all came together. But I think I will stop talking for now and let you both introduce yourself. Nad, should I go first?
Sure. So I'm Nadia Gardner-Charles and I am the Director of Safeguarding at the Artist Safeguarding and Wellbeing Hub. I'm also a counselling psychologist accredited by the UKCP and currently doing a big piece of research around trauma in the Black diaspora and counselling psychology currently.
Thank you. And
Hello.
hello.
So I am Yabuanusun, also known as Ya Sankufa. My pronouns are she and her. I'm the founder of a creative wellbeing space called Our Naked Truths that centres the healing futures of Black women and non-binary people in the diaspora. I'm also an embodied relational integrative therapist and counsellor, accredited by BACP and currently doing my master's to finalise and finish this journey as a psychotherapist. And that's all right.
Thank you. Honestly, I think just being with you guys makes me so happy. So I think it's so important to have, especially like Black women therapists that really can hold space, but also understand where you're coming from. And I think both of you guys have been so integral in terms of like my healing journey as we kind of became introduced really, or we kind of explored this topic together from 2020. For me, my relationship with this topic starts from a very young age. I think by the time I was about 7 years old, I had already experienced sexual abuse on maybe like 4 or 5 occasions, 4 or 5 different separate occasions. And I think from a very young age, I think one of the first things that I remember doing was creating a story in my head around why this stuff was happening to me or had happened to me. I remember like at 5 thinking, maybe I'm a witch. Like, maybe this is why. Maybe I have like special powers that, makes men attracted to me. And so that's a story that I held for a long time in my head. And I think whilst I, as an adult, recognize that, that doesn't make any sense. Well, it doesn't make any sense as an adult recognizing that. But I think as a child, I think that story helped me to contextualize or create a narrative around like what was going on potentially. But I think actually it was quite a harmful story that I told myself, and that, played out in, my own self-confidence, self-esteem, etc. And I think a lot of people that I've spoken to who have experienced sexual abuse at a young age do tell these stories to themselves to try and make sense of what's happened. And so I wanted to ask you both, first of all, what is the role of kind of like that storytelling, and what are the impacts of that storytelling? Because I think there are some elements of like psychological safety that we, are the reasons why we tell those stories, but actually it can cause quite long-term harm in terms of like our self-identity. So first question, what is the role of storytelling in how a survivor navigates?
I think you've kind of already spoken about it. It's a way to cope. It's a way to make sense of the story. And especially when we're thinking about abuse and trauma that's happened from a really young age, where there isn't really like the psychological processing or the cognitive understanding around what's happened. It's a way to make sense. But it also is another thing. There's a concept or theory around internalizing the abuser. So it's a way of internalizing what's happened, because you've got nobody else outside to say, this is wrong, or this shouldn't be happening, or to help you make sense of it. So you end up internalizing the abuser and internalizing the story that's the story within the dynamic between you and the abuser. So that's another big part of it. It's a way to make sense, but it also is quite harmful. Because internalizing the abuser, you're also trying to not only just make sense of what's happening, but you're then trying to make a reason for what's happening. And that reason tends to be in that narrative and the storytelling that you are to blame, that you are the reason. And actually that reason doesn't exist within you. It's like a projection from the abuse. So that's a big part of it. The long-term impacts, I think we can probably both talk about that, which I think will be quite important. It's not only the internalizing of the abuse, creating a story that doesn't actually belong to you to try and make sense of it, then it becomes a part of your identity. And then we see as we get older, like creating those stories, becoming a part of your identity, you end up starting having a fractured sense of self, which ends up being the long-term impact, one of the long-term impacts.
And I think to add to that, there's elements as well of something called existential ways of reflecting on things that have happened to you. And that there's so many different theories around it, right? However, it is a prevalent part of who we are. And not everybody understands the element of what that experience is that you're portraying outside of the remit of the structured world, which comes into that role play within that storytelling, because it's a way of actually trying to communicate and conversate what has gone on for the person. Again, it's whether individuals, whether experienced or not, actually take the time to stop, listen, and actively listen to what the existential experience is happening within that storytelling form. But it is a way actually of communicating and sometimes expressing the need for support and the need for help. There's so much elements to that storytelling though, which can go into, again, the embodied experience, which Yar has mentioned, and it is about that internal object, which was mentioned again. And the internal object can be harmful equally. It can sometimes as well, if I want to be controversial in things, there can be elements of that where the person internalizes that object, and even though it's negative to their self, it becomes a positive part of being able to cope. So there is elements that can be seen in different forms of that.
So I think, well, thank you both for sharing. I think I really do enjoy, because I think I've had to do a lot of like research and learning for my own self. And I really do want to become a therapist one day, because I think it's so cool. But it's really lovely to hear you both speak about, yeah, kind of like, yeah, you're ever so. I have to say, guys, I think generally speaking, I can be quite short of words sometimes, and I think throughout this podcast, please be patient with me because I think this topic is quite sensitive for me as well, and so I'm gonna struggle sometimes to find my words and to get my thoughts out because I think it is quite a complex topic for me, but I think also just in general. And I think going back to what you said about kind of like that storytelling piece, there's something that you said, yeah, that stuck out to me because I think one of the first things so aside from kind of like that storytelling piece, I think my first, one of the cases that happened pre-7 ended up in the courts. And I remember, I think it was around like 5 years old, going to the police station and having to give a testimony of what had happened. And I remember, being like, oh yeah, like a hairy caterpillar. The joke guys in the book, the hairy caterpillar book. Yes, that's how I described what happened. And I think even at that age, such a young age, I remember lying to the police officer about what had happened in the sense that the police officer asked me, did you touch it? And because the police officer did you touch it? And I said no, like I lied about it. And I think even that for me is like, why would I lie about it? Do you know what I mean? And I think there's a thing around kind of like internalized shame that I think isn't necessarily something that as a child you grow up with, but I think actually we are indoctrinated into a kind of like a shame model. I don't know what the word. We learn shame around, especially around sex, and I think it'd be good to kind of like hear your thoughts around how can we remove those stigmas and shame so that if a child, or if it may be like a parent, is having to navigate this with their child, how can we create safe spaces or raise people in a way where there isn't that shame that obviously is a barrier to disclosures or to honesty or to etc.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the question, actually. It's a big question, right? How do you navigate shame? And to be honest, I think for me being really transparent, I don't have an answer for you in regards to navigate shame. There's so many different elements that come with that, from culture, from, how you were raised parent-wise, and there's so many different things that factor into it. I think something that I'm trying to build within ASWA, especially, I deal with more adolescents into adults, and it's conditioned, it's taught behavior and it's learnt behavior. That element of shame will grow with you as you become into your adult life, right? And I think one of the biggest challenges even now is being able to break down the boundaries and allow people to have that and to navigate that sense of, I can speak without judgment. I can speak without actually feeling that I should be the one to blame. That's really difficult. Because that element of guilt, and I'm going on, but the element of guilt, I think, for all of us, is triggered in such different ways. And working with so many survivors, irrespective of if it's not the fault of themselves, that element of guilt still seems to be the forefront of the scenario, more so than what the actual scenario is. Does that make sense? So I don't think I've really answered the question because I'm still processing that. And it's just something whereby I think as a community, we all need to work on, well, how do we actually get, is there, I think the question for me is there a way of being able to alleviate that? I'm not sure, but we need these conversations in order to break down that process of, well, what does that potentially look like? And how can that work for yourself, Elsie, as opposed to you, Yar, as opposed to me? We're so different. But yeah, that's the best that I can give you at this moment.
Yeah, thank you.
I hear that. And thank you. And I think it is important because it is big. And there are so many different elements to it. There's the systemic element, there's the cultural element, there's the gendered element as well, and then you've got age and intergenerational aspects of that. And I really honour the fact you kind of bringing that case study actually and thinking about how a young person or a child will understand what's happened to them and then share that story, but then also having a felt sense, like an embodied felt sense that maybe I shouldn't say too much because something is wrong. And if something is wrong because I was a part of that experience, I was the one that was wrong. So kind of internalizing that shame, internalizing the guilt, internalizing the role of the perpetrator on you. And there is something that's cultural about that, because even though you wouldn't have been taught that, it was felt. And there is something about within cultures, cultural systems, familial systems, social systems, an understanding of right and wrong. And so especially when it comes to sex, like, and there's a lot of shame around it when you add like religion and things and genitals and body parts and who should be touching and talking and all of those things. So I think children, without having open discussions with parents around their bodies, the safety of their body, how to interact with others, there will naturally be shame placed around the things that we shouldn't be doing. I think in terms of, I don't have like a big answer for all of it, because I do think there are so many different aspects. And especially when we think about abuse, shame never really belongs to the victim. Shame always belongs to the perpetrator. And then also the people that have enabled the perpetrator. So we have to think about safeguarding and the duty of care being everybody, especially when we think about children. Every adult who is in relation to that young person has a responsibility to safeguard that person and have a duty of care for them. So the shame also lies with the people that should be protecting that young person too, to an extent. And so when I think about different ways in which we can support children to be able to speak a bit clearer around disclosure, but also start to think about mitigating some of that shame. I think some of that also is around conversations that caregivers have with children around their bodies. And I was having a conversation with a friend recently who has a toddler, really young child, and going into nursery, and the fear around putting your baby in a space where other people are going to be caring for them and them still not having the full ability to really articulate things yet. And we were talking about ways in which to talk, you know, there's children who are toddlers, who are young, and especially the children that I'm thinking about, playful, open, you know, willing to talk to any adult. And thinking about, okay, actually supporting them to know not everybody you need to go to. And how do we do that with a toddler? Thinking about actually talking to them about their body parts, their genitals, and actually giving language to some of that. And understanding, so if there was ever a disclosure, they can name the body parts without shame, because it's normalized within the home. Things like that I think are really important. And also starting to gently think about ways of how we support young people to have agency over their bodies. Especially when I think about, you know, I'm West African, I'm Ghanaian, and thinking about the ways in which we revere elders, right? Elders are revered. I'm quite conflicted around that, because I don't believe that every elder should be. And, you know, respect is just given without being earned. And we will support children, you know, go into a party, go and hug that uncle, go and hug that auntie. And the child might have an embodied response to, I don't want to do that. But then there's a false, no, you're being rude, go and hug that adult. And actually, it's really important. We're already telling that child that you don't have agency over your body, that actually the elder here has agency over you. And I think we need to start changing that narrative by listening to a young person. If they don't want to go and say hello, there's other ways in which they can make contact. Maybe they might wave. Maybe that will be okay. Maybe they can shake a hand. Maybe they can give an elbow. They don't have to go and give their body to somebody they're not quite sure of, because that already takes away the agency. So I think really supporting children to have language around what agency means in a really soft, gentle way. So it helps to normalize these conversations and where safety has been breached. And I think stuff like that is really important.
And I've got something on that. I mean, I know it's Elsie's podcast, but
no, guys, this is conversation.
It's conversation. I'm really intrigued, because you talk about the West African culture, right? And you're right. And I'm sitting there thinking, I know for me that certain times energy, if I don't feel or someone's just, I will be like, hi, and that's okay, without being told you're rude. And I'm wondering, especially from a cultural perspective, I'm not from Ghana, so for, you know, But how do you implement that, or how would you look at the implementation of that into the culture, especially with the elders who sometimes are so stuck in their ways, and equally when you don't, greet in the way that their expectations are, all of a sudden it becomes another problem. How do you, and what would be the steps, especially for the younger guys, now who are having children, who are actually going through that? What does that look like?
I'm already starting to see some of that transition because of when we think about just sexual violence, gender-based violence, sexual abuse within Black, African, Caribbean communities. We're already now knowing that there's more of these stories than we thought. It is way more prevalent, way more common than we thought. And we're already starting to, I think there's a lot of critical reflection that's going on within, I guess, the younger generation, the millennials, etc., of thinking about, the great things that we can take from our elders and the culture and the things that we want to leave behind. And already starting to make changes in how they parent, in how they speak to children, and how they are around children. So it is an intergenerational conversation. I would love elders to be a part of this conversation. And I know it can be quite complicated because a lot of the cultural practices are rooted in honouring tradition. And there is beauty in that, but there's also a lot of problems. And we also need to think about the assimilation that came from our elders. They were assimilating, and a lot of it was, we want you to do well. We're going to put all of these things in place for you so you can do well and not struggle in the same way that we did. And there wasn't really much critical reflection around maybe some of the practices that we have. And we're changing some of that. And in ways in which I do it, I like to think about it doesn't need to be one big old conversation that we need to be having. It's little things that you can implement in day to day. And also holding an acceptance that my elders aren't always going to understand that. And that's okay. That's your reference point. That's your context. But I know why I'm doing this thing. So, for example, when I go and see like friends or like family members with children, and they're like, "Oh, go and greet auntie," and I'll wait to see what their response is. Children generally like me, but some people are a bit more curious, and that's absolutely fine. So I'll ask them, "Do you want a handshake? Do you want a wave? Do you want an elbow? Do you want a fist bump?" Give them the options so then they can choose on how they want to greet me. And that's important. So they get to make a choice. So I'm really supporting them in having agency. You get to choose how you interact with me. And that's okay. If someone just want to wave, that's absolutely fine. And when those little things of just encourage, and it doesn't have to, as I said, it's not a big thing, but these small things have a big impact, actually, because we're already starting to change messaging around what is normal, what is acceptable, and what should be done. So I think things like that are really important. I think having conversations with children, like really exploring their experience, understanding the phenomenology of what they're thinking and feeling, and really listening to children. And also changing this idea, which I think is we're starting to dismantle anyway. But when I think about especially West African practice, and a lot of other cultures operate in a similar way, where children are seen and not heard. And actually, when we think about, coming from collectivist cultures, collectivist cultures means that everybody within that collective is important. Everybody is a part of that collective. Everybody has a role in that collective, and that includes children. And so therefore, it's really important for us to be listening to children, listening to the stories that they tell, watching how they draw, watching those things tell us a lot of information. And rather than punishing a child because we are maybe navigating our own guilt around not being able to protect and provide safety for that child, taking that away to someone that can hold that space for you, and then allowing yourself to be embodied and present and really exploring what's happening with children, asking questions. When they're saying something, really listening. What does that mean for you? Absolutely. Watching their body language with people, like how they're responding to different adults and what that might mean for them. And then maybe asking some questions around, why didn't you want to say hello to that person?
And that's a really pivotal point, actually, punishing.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had in the last 2 months within my practice of African and Caribbean diaspora, the punishing part is mainly due to the silence. which has been very punishing for them.
Mm.
And it's sometimes when you mention about punishing, sometimes people think, oh, well, it's going to be, physical harm. No, actually, but asking the questions, you're absolutely right, is such more of a present moment for child and adult.
Yeah.
As opposed to just being, and that silencing moment, which actually can just completely feel for a person like you're not even interested or hearing me, and it's huge.
Yeah, it's huge. Silence is a disavowal and silence is shaming. And I think about, so I'm in private practice, but I'm also, I work in clinical placements, and one of my placements is working with survivors, an amazing organisation and a great resource for community called 1 in 4, who work with survivors of gender-based, of sexual violence, sexual abuse and child sexual abuse, with any gender. So any person can go there, and it's been an amazing experience, rewarding, painful, to see what people are experiencing. But what's been interesting is in all of the stories, and most of my private practice, because most of my private practice also are people that have experienced gender-based violence or sexual violence in some way, shape or form, and most of them are Black and Asian people. And it's so interesting to think about, when we think about silence as being shameful, think about the cultural silence that happens, the familial silence. And this is also across culture and race. Like when we think about systems that we're in who don't acknowledge what's happened to you. And then there's a silence with that. Yeah. And that is shaming, actually. That also adds to the shame. That also adds to a sense of feeling like this is a disavowal of my experience, that maybe it didn't happen. Yeah. Maybe it is my fault. Because nobody else who's witnessed what's happened or has heard what's saying is standing up for me or advocating or willing to support me to seek justice. And I think it's those things that are also really important, not only when we're talking about children and being able to support them to talk, but also us.
Of course.
Like creating spaces to have these conversations with any age, regardless of when abuse has happened, whether it's a child, a teenager, an adult, to be really making sure there is space for talking about it. I've also, it's quite interesting, like in my local community and also within my practice, people talking about they've disclosed to certain family members or loved ones, and then it never gets spoken about again.
Yeah.
And some of that is also maybe because people don't feel equipped to have that conversation. Oh, I don't want to trigger them again. And I don't. And some of that, we need to be a bit more critical and maybe a bit more curious around what that means for us. We don't want to shame them. Do we not want to shame or trigger them? Or do we feel like we're going to be triggered by having that conversation? Do we feel like we're not able to have that conversation because it's too dark or it's too complicated or it's too evil? And I think we need to start normalizing having these discussions about abuse. It is painful. It speaks to one of the most heinous, dark, shadowy sides of humanity, but it exists. And so many people are experiencing that and suffering in silence. So it's really important for us to be creating spaces where we can have that dialogue, especially if someone has disclosed to you, by checking in again. How are they after they've disclosed to you? What might they need from you? And if you are struggling around, okay, I'm not quite sure how to have this conversation again, ask the person. Would it be helpful for me to ask about this again? What would be useful? How would I know that today isn't a good day to talk about it? What would I need to know? Those sorts of things. Yeah. Really simple things. Really important. I don't know if that answers. I know we've gone off.
Yeah. No, but it's been honest. Yeah. I think, it's interesting because I think someone mentioned it earlier about how also the kind of like the cultural silence then plays into kind of like the survivor silence. And I think for me, when I went to court at 5, I think I didn't really speak about, I don't remember speaking about it again until I was probably about 13 with my friends in secondary school. And I think from the instance, the child instances up to about 7, I think past 7, I think I had a relatively normal childhood. I didn't speak about it again, like I said, until 13. I think 13, is a very again, a really interesting age, because when, you know, the emotions come in, the puberty kicks in. And I think that's around 30, my teens, is when I then started to revisit or see the impacts of what happened to me as a child. And I think also your body's growing, I'm getting, you know, bum, breast, everything. I mean, I think around that time, you know, you're becoming more visible to the male gaze, or becoming more aware of the male gaze. And I think, 13 was an interesting time in terms of like the emotions that I went through. I think that was around the time that I also started self-harming. I used to cut my arms. I think I attempted a suicide maybe like once or twice. And I think even in my friendship group as well, because there was a group of us and all of us were just, I think at 13, I don't know why, we all just started making disclosures to each other and like just trauma dumping, you know, amongst each other. It was trauma dumping, but sharing, you know. I think, I think around that time, it was just very emotionally heavy. And I think that we didn't have the tools to kind of like cope with what was happening. So I think there were a few of us that were, you know, drinking a lot. I remember I was drinking a lot. A few people, you know, were accessing porn, etc. And so I think that teenage period, I think, is just loaded. And I think it'd be interesting again to hear your perspective on what makes those teen periods so, apart from the emotions. I probably would explain, but I think I like hearing you guys speak, because actually it's so interesting. It's like, wow, I was about the knowledge. Honestly, it's great. 'Cause I don't really have the language sometimes, and I think it's so interesting hearing the language come out from both of you. So it'd be good to kind of like hear your perspective on what makes those teen years so emotionally loaded, and coping mechanisms. I think, because I think also around that period, I think it's so important, because I go into schools now doing PSHE workshops, and I think it's so important that, especially in those teen years, therapy is provided as a blanket for kids. I think every child, I think, you know, we have like PSHE classes. I think, no, there needs to be a therapist for every single child at secondary school. I think it's so important, because actually you've navigated so much as a child, and probably are still navigating stuff in those teen years. And actually there's no support or resources or tools that are given kind of like how to navigate those things. And obviously around that time, I'm not really speaking to my parents about what's going on. You know, all these things are happening. No one's none the wiser except my friends. Do you know what I mean? And so because kind of like hear your perspective on, you know, what's happening with young people around those teen years, and ways that I think not only schools and organizations or families could support children, but also how can teens themselves support themselves in those periods.
I do want to say also, I know you're saying you don't have the language, but you do have the language,
Thank
actually.
you.
And I think that's important. We don't always have to be thinking about, you know, theoretical and analytical terms in order to describe trauma. I think it's important actually we normalize it and using the language that we have. And there's always stuff that we can build on. But I really love hearing you speak.
Oh, likewise.
Just wanted to add that.
Thank you.
Good questions. Great questions. I guess I'm thinking about when you're a teenager, as well as like hormones development, and we're starting to really develop a sense of self. We're trying to be a bit more curious about who we are. And then there's also the acting out that happens with most teenagers anyway, because you're trying to claim space, you're trying to refine who you are as a person, what your identity means, what it means within the different contexts that we're in, so especially school. And so there's that part. And then when I'm thinking about the acting out that happens also in trauma, and trying to reclaim some sort of control over what's happened, because control has been taken and a sense of agency has been taken. And then also thinking about when we're acting out and not having the language really, or the support or the resources, we look for different coping mechanisms. And so that's for me kind of what I'm hearing in your experience, and what's quite common. And that even happens with adults too, especially where we haven't had control. We'll try and trying to reclaim that control or power back, sometimes in unhealthy methods, but that's all we have. That may feed into eating disorders, that may feed into substance misuse or alcohol dependency, that may feed into risky behaviors. You know, that all of these different things of where we're acting out, but also these behaviors are actually a way to reclaim control, and a way to try and make sense of things, and also numb sometimes and escape the storytelling or the experience that's happened. And so when I'm thinking about what we can do as a society and as communities and as adults, and also thinking about our schooling systems, like it's really interesting when we think about PSHE, for example, we'll talk about sex and preventative ways of not to have sex, and maybe a little bit around safe sex and how to prevent STDs and STIs, pregnancy, and all of that. And a lot of that seems to be placed on the woman and the girl child in that, which is quite interesting, and less about men. And I do think there's something about our schooling systems needing to be a bit more gender affirmative, that we need to be dismantling kind of patriarchal rhetoric that feeds into where shame is placed and who has responsibility. But then there's also something about, if we're able to talk about sex in school, why are we not talking about sexual abuse? That should be happening within schools. That would also be supporting young people to be aware of maybe experiences that they've had that maybe it shouldn't have happened. And I think there's also something about thinking about not just adults abusing young children, but also peer-on-peer abuse.
Yeah.
Which is huge.
Huge.
And thinking about ways in which young people can be cultivating safety and what is appropriate contact, what isn't, what is consensual. We talk about consent, but we don't talk about consent in relation to abuse. And I think that's important, to be having those conversations in schools, and also supporting caregivers and adults in community to also be having those conversations with young people, which help to then normalize some of that language so young people aren't having to internalize it. Like, my heart was breaking when I was listening to you, but then I was also like, how incredible. And this is quite interesting, isn't it? When we may not always know why we're friends with someone, but we get a sense that they're kin. There's something about them that feels very similar to us. And it's quite normal for some people who have experienced trauma to maybe, in some ways, without even realizing it, to connect to other people that have experienced similar types of trauma. And the same thing is like with neurodivergence, for example, neurodiversity. You'll find that, you know, okay, I've got ADHD, and then you're looking at your friends, oh, and so do you. You find that your crew is just a neurodivergent crew. And there's something like, there's almost like an embodied awareness of maybe there's something connected to us that we don't have language for. It's just felt. And it's energetic as well. So I'm thinking about that for you and many other people that probably have had similar experiences, whereby they've connected with other people and from a very young age, not quite sure, and then learning in their trauma story how similar it is. And I think even though it was probably quite scary as a child to be sitting with all your friends and hearing all of these painful stories, there's also something powerful about having a collective that can witness each other. May not have all the right resources to know what to do with that information, but what's powerful is there was a disclosure made and it was held in that space by other people that could identify with your experience. And that's powerful.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of people that grow up without that.
Yeah.
You know,
that's
that are alone.
Facts, yeah.
And alone in their experience and not having anybody that can share it or identify or support them, which compounds the shame and compounds the silence. So I think, having more spaces, like psychoeducational spaces within schools, within communities, within community centres, like any spaces where young people are going to be communing, really. We're talking about consent and we love whipping out that. And in some ways it's become a bit of a buzzword.
Yeah.
We're not really like breaking down the nuances of exactly what that means, you know, and thinking about all the different intricacies and nuances around how abuse can happen, peer on peer, intergenerational, intrafamilial, like all of those conversations I think should be happening. And I don't know if society's ready for that yet, because there is still so much shame around abuse and it feels too scary for people to talk about, but we need to be talking about it because it's happening. It's not stopped. It's happening.
It's something, because I think there's a recent change in the laws, because I think I've been doing sexual abuse workshops in secondary schools. I think kind of across all ages has changed. Like for key stage 3, I think it's more stuff around, you know, peer pressure, boundaries, and then when we get to kind of like key stage 4, it's more about sexual abuse and harassment, etc. I think those conversations are happening, but I think they need to be happening in ways that I think culturally sensitive, and like I said, and relevant, because otherwise it just feels very detached. And it feels like another boring lecture. Do you know what I mean? And actually, people that have experienced it in these classrooms, I think something that I want to do more of is also teaching young people how to hold those spaces for each other, because I think it's not something that we necessarily learn. It's something that I think we innately kind of like feel and learn how to do, but it's not something we actually, you know, it's a taught thing, you know, how to hold space for people, how to listen, how to advocate for your friends that are going through these things. It's really interesting. Yes.
Yeah, no, I think you made a good point about also like the culture. I really love the idea of creating like peer-on-peer advocacy and training and witnessing groups within young people, and also thinking about what will be relevant for them as well, and like how they can support and resource themselves in terms of being space holders essentially. And like, I love watching how incredible like our next generation are so intelligent, so resourceful, so wise, like who are becoming like our, I mean, they are next leaders, and just having spaces in which they can be empowered to do so, but in a way that where they're also resourced and supported, and not taking away from the responsibility of adults, because we have responsibility for them. But there is something about the cultural sensitivity aspect that I think is important, especially when we think about intrafamilial abuse, incest, and also just abuse that happens within community, in different community spaces, whether it's in church or those spaces, and understanding how different cultures operate are really important. Understanding the reverence, for example, with elders, understanding some of the kind of cultural nuances around how we engage with each other, what's on the table to talk about and what isn't on the table to talk about, and how that can be understood in schools and communicated to those groups from a place of their understanding and their context. Because it's interesting thinking about, I guess, the Eurocentricity of that, and it doesn't always really speak to our families. You know, we don't talk back. We don't, there's certain things that we just don't do. We're not allowed to really question our elders, and then be thinking about how the role of abuse within that. So if you're not allowed to question your elders, you're not allowed to talk back, and you're not allowed to, what happens when a young person within that cultural system has also been abused? They're going to be even more silenced. In what ways can we encourage and identify there might be something going on with this young person within this particular cultural context? And I think it is important to have schools to do that, and maybe working with people from those communities within the schools to be partnering up, to learning from the cultural systems that they have, and making sure that they're appropriate for those children in their school.
And I think it's also important as well. I like the idea of you thinking about actually holding space. It's powerful peer to peer, but it's also safeguarding them as well. Because that is, I'm sure you also as therapists, we hold a lot. And it's therefore, how then do you release that in a way that is safe for us? And I know that sometimes I can actively say that I struggle. I struggle to release that. Holding so much information that really is it's hurtful, it's painful, it's very hard. And I think as well, I also have to think of the young people of today, the adolescents. I think being an ex-secondary school teacher, the time that you're talking about is a common time. It's year 8. That is one of the hardest years. And I will state that with experience. You start secondary school, it's all new, it's great, it's fun, everything's it's a buzz. Year 8 is quite dormant, actually. There's not much being done there. It's much more time for, we've got friends, we're more reflective mode, we're actually thinking about things that have happened past, things come up, the trauma experiences, the exploration, the boredom. It really hits. And that for me has always been a thing where it's that dark space. That year 8 is the dark space. Because then year 9, at that point, it's not that it's forgotten. It's just that now they're going towards GCSE. There's more stuff to think about. More stuff's in place. More that it starts to ramp up a bit. That particular year group age is the most for me. And I say it. I may be wrong, but this is my own lived experience of it. That is the most important year. That is the part where, if anything should be done for schools, for peers, for therapists, it's going from year 7 into year 8, because that is where I tend to find, and just thinking about 2 of my actual clients at the moment, year 8 was their problem. And it's gone into adult years, wherein it's quite damaging. And the things I hear is, Yeah, but the teachers didn't really do anything.
Yeah.
They didn't, and we didn't get the resources.
Yeah.
And the resources still aren't there, you know. And I do speak for myself, and I'm sure, you will add. There does need to be therapists in school.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree with that.
Yeah. Sure.
It's an integral part, actually,
Yeah.
of the entire education system. It's an integral part for teachers also. Because we talk about sexual and physical, emotional abuse, you've got power and authority. That as an abusive element, especially when people are already going through something else at home, and then to experience it. And sometimes it doesn't, it's again, that word silent, but extremely damaging, yet there's no one to navigate that. Because there isn't anyone and I'm not saying it in an arrogant way, but of who has that speciality to deal with that. You know, there's not that person to navigate or to say, actually, there's not a team. There's no, you've got pastoral.
Yeah.
But then I can go into a whole debate of what I believe pastoral to be at this moment in time.
Yeah.
Because the pastoral care, for what I do see, can actually be equally quite damaging and lead to other areas of things that shouldn't be happening to young people. So yes, I do. I mean, how do we do it? I mean, I know in my business mind how I'd like to do it. But again, it's working with those challenges. You mentioned self-harm. And again, I see self-harm in such a different light. And I don't want to I'm like you. My words take time and
come out,
and it's absolutely fine. I'm not that person that likes to intellectualize things. I like to be simple, to be honest. It just works for me, right? But equally, the self-harm is also, as Yar said, it is a form of acting out, but it's also a second skin.
What do you mean?
A second skin in the sense that sometimes when you self-harm or when you go to the elements of alcoholism, you're trying to, the skin that was already there, the skin that was already damaged, you're trying to actually improve to a second skin, a new beginning, without actually understanding the depths of that new beginning and what it is. There's a really good book actually that I will ask you to put up, and it's all about self-harm. It's all about the second skin. And it's so interesting, actually. And it talks about that new development of, which you unconsciously are aware of, of that trauma. But you're trying to build yourself into another person.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And it's an excellent book. But again, I reiterate, for me and what I've seen, year 8 is the time wherein that is where it tends to exacerbate more. At that particular, it's a more clearer understanding, maybe. I don't know. It's more awareness. You've got, again, what you said, peers together, talking about things, exploration of things, and things are coming out. And it's more time. It's more time to sit with it.
Yeah.
And that can go, I've always said it, and I've seen students, it either goes well, in the sense that they are able to talk, discuss, really gain the support, or it can go quite badly. And that sticks with throughout. Or I've had students where they don't even get past year 8 because it's so damaging for them mentally and physically, and they can't pass it. So I don't want to say that. I suppose what I'm trying to say is, at that particular point, is it a normal process? As a teacher, I would say for year 8, it is a normal process. Evidently, though, everybody's experiences are very different, you know. But the challenges of year 8, that emotional awareness, sometimes the emotional deregulation, for me as a teacher, is something whereby I will say is a normal experience for me to see. And I would expect most teachers but it doesn't happen. To actually, at that point, is where they're stepping in and things are starting to be put in place. But that is where the challenge comes at the moment. It's not happening in that way.
Yeah.
I do want to add that when I was talking about acting out, I wasn't saying self-harm I was thinking about kind of the risky behaviours and the different coping mechanisms.
Yeah.
Because I see self-harm as not only just a coping mechanism, but it's also a form of pain reduction. Like if I harm myself, and we're talking about, the basic versions of self-harm, but self-harm can happen in lots of different ways.
Yeah.
But, somebody self-harming to reduce the pain that they're feeling, and it allows
Internally,
a release. The emotional pain that you're experiencing, it allows a release, and then therefore I've been able to mitigate it exploding. It's a way to cope, and I understand, and there's also pain reduction in it. So I think it is important to be thinking, but not that that's a form of just acting out. That is a really powerful tool for a lot of people to cope. And a form of pain reduction, and sometimes is a lot safer than other tools. So I just wanted to honestly clarify that. That's what I meant.
Like with this topic, I think even self-harm deserves its own, do you know what I mean? Its own section. Because like for me, self-harm looks so different over the years. And I think, when I was around that kind of like 13, 14, it was, cutting myself. It was, overdosing on medication, etc. I think as I kind of like stopped those behaviors, maybe it was, the drinking, entertaining risky, engaging in risky behaviors, entertaining relationships that maybe were harmful to me. And I think I think I used to, when I stopped self-harming via that methods and means, I remember I used to like draw myself with henna. I used to kind of like write all the thoughts that I had about myself on myself with henna. Obviously not, they weren't good things, but that was also like a form of self-harm that looked different. Do you know what I mean? But it was still self-harming, even though I used to speak to myself, self-harming thoughts, etc. So I think it deserves its own topic, because it is so broad and so vast. And I think a lot of us still as adults, even though we may not, self-harm in certain ways that we think self-harming is, but, if maybe we're not, neglecting ourselves, hygiene, neglect, do you know what I mean? There's so many ways it just looks different for different people, different ways, different years, different times of their lives. So I think that kind of like that teenage period, I think was highly volatile, and I think to a certain extent it is probably natural in terms of like the emotions that come with like puberty, your body's changing, everything's like changing internally and externally, and I think there needs to be understanding for young people about hormones and how those things impact us, but not only on a like biological level, because a lot of that is taught biologically, but actually how that plays out spiritually, mentally, emotionally, do you know what I mean? And ways to navigate those different feelings and emotions, etc. Not only just via the classroom learning, but also how can we create practices and workshops, experiences that actually allow them to navigate those emotions, or give them real world skills to navigate those emotions, I think would be really important. I think from that kind of like basis of 13, I think that's when, again, I think the issue of sexual abuse really began to become alive for me in terms of my life. I think even in terms of like who I started to look at, because I think 13, I was like, becoming aware of myself as a woman, navigating, I think, even like religious ideas of what it means to be a good woman versus navigating the media, what it means to be a desirable woman, and like wanting to kind of like replicate what I'm seeing on TV, the girl shaking like this, do you know what I mean? Versus wanting to also be a good woman according to biblical standards, X, Y, and Z, also want to be pretty, all these different things, I think, trying to navigate. And I think that kind of like takes us to 16. And 15 is kind of like when I began to become curious about sex. And I think 16 is when we then get into this issue of my experience of child sexual exploitation and grooming, I would say, as well. And I think with that teenage period, someone mentioned about power and authority. I think around those years, we're still kind of like navigating what it means to be under someone else's jurisdiction. And actually, you mentioned it as well, like some of these outside communal spaces, like the church. I think 14 is when I started dancing. And we'll get into kind of like the creatives or the creative arts as a method of self-expression. Because actually, I think around that time is when, I mean, I've always had like a creative background. And I think around that time is when I really started to use the arts as a form of expression. Year 11, you know, I'm making body pieces. I have this, I used to do a lot of life drawing work around that time. And I have this artwork where all my old diaries, like journaling, I think was a massive tool for me as well in terms of like navigating my experience. Actually, yeah, I think before we go into the kind of like the child exploitation series, I think, or section, I think speaking about some of the tools that I had available to me at that time, like the sister cycles weren't really important. But then I think journaling was massive for me. I used to, used to be such an emotional journaler. Like I'd like blink tears onto my journal and be like, this is my tear. Do you know what I mean? I used to draw a circle around it. Can you see my tears on my paper? Like I was such a I don't know, so romantic in terms of like my self-processing. But I used to write like a lot of heavy stuff. And I remember there was an art piece that I made where I had collaged all the different things in my journal around kind of like this art piece, this self-portrait that I had done. And it was kind of like all the negative things I said about myself, and like, oh yeah, I've kissed this boy, and and that was for me a visual representation of all the things that I had thought and felt about my body. And again, like I would speak at the teachers, like if a student in your class has made a piece of work and it's their body, and it's like, oh yeah, it's like, surely someone should pick up on that and be like, what's happening here? Do you know what I mean? But that didn't really happen. And I think around that time was when I all started dancing. Dancing for me was massive in terms of like finding a route to express myself, because again, I think I've always struggled. I think it's that silence, you know, I've always kept silent about my experiences. Dance was massive in terms of giving me a way to speak without having to use words. Writing as well. Writing allowed me to speak without having to say anything. And it's actually my journaling that ended up in my second court case when I was 13. I remember the court case was online. And so I did my testimony from my house. It was like an online thing. And with that, the courts ruled that there wasn't enough evidence to take the case forward. And actually, I think it's important to note at this point that I think it's only 2.7 of cases that actually go to the full end. And so I think there's a lot around like how people disclose, whether or not even like reporting how safe it is. It never felt safe to me. I hated that whole process. You know, the defendant lawyer accused me of wanting to write my own story, because I used to read a lot of books, a lot of fictional books, and so yeah, the defendant said that I'm lying about what happened, and that the only reason I wrote that down is because I'm trying to write my own story. And so even stuff like that was like, I remember bursting into tears when she said that. And I think that whole process was so unsafe and harmful. And I think we also need to think about how we make the reporting safe for people. Didn't expect to be theory, but that's okay. So I think, yeah, just looking at like myself at that time, like I do really like feel for young people that are having to kind of like make disclosures or talk about these things in these unsafe environments, and people will push people to report. But I think if I'm being honest, I don't even want to push people to report, because actually it's like, it's so unsafe for people to do that. And I think there's so much harm that comes from these systems that are meant to hold space for our trauma, that actually they don't have the resources to do that, or the emotional resources or the cultural resources to do that. And I think even, we'll go into this a bit later, when I made the kind of like my third report in 2020, even that process was unsafe. Do you know what I mean? And I was an adult at that time. Oh, thank you.
Thank you for letting us witness you and being so generous with your story and your experience, because I think you're speaking truth to power, actually, and using your experience as a testimony for so many other people who feel voiceless. And there's so many elements of your story that you've just brought around what it means to disclose and navigate the criminal justice system, and the lack of safety around that, the lack of witnessing and curiosity within adults who have a duty of care and safeguarding responsibility to maybe picking up on small indicators. And I think things like that, you're talking about schools, but we're also thinking about the clinics. You know, as a teenager going to the clinic regularly, what is happening there around nurses and assistants and people working in the clinics, not maybe being curious around why this girl keeps presenting here,
Yeah.
what that means. And then I think about the role in which people that operate within those systems really have to really support the witnessing part. Witnessing is so important for any trauma that someone's experienced, but especially for sexual violence, to be witnessed, whether that's in therapy, whether that's with family members or chosen family or loved ones. It is so important to be witnessed and to be acknowledged for what's happened to you and to be validated.
Yeah.
And then where need be, to be advocated for.
Yeah.
I wish we could advocate for more survivors to get justice, but we also know the criminal justice system isn't robust enough to support and protective enough to support those people. But if there is anybody that is thinking about doing that and going down the criminal justice system, you know, there are so many different forms of support to really advocate and support you, such as the ISHVAs, which are independent sexual violence advocates. They are also attached to some local police stations, but there are also organisations within the community that Women's Trust, for example, have them. Women's Rape Aid. There's so many other organisations, I forget now, that also have access to ISHVAs, and not just for women as well, also for men and non-binary people that have experienced that. Gallup is an amazing organisation in the queer community who look after people that have experienced abuse and sexual violence. And they also have access to ISHVAs. So thinking about different people that can support you to advocate within those systems are really important, because you can't do it alone. Yeah, it's such a contentious space. Yeah, that isn't victim centered and survivor centered within that. That makes it difficult. Yeah, to come through. Can I touch your hands?
Okay then. But yeah, so 13 was kind of like, lots of stuff happening. Art became my saving grace in terms of finding ways to express myself and explore what happened to me. I think it's a tool that I recommend for everyone, and for kind of like just people in general. Like the creative arts are so important, I think, in navigating our lives and understanding and communicating what's happening to us, but also I think need more support from schools and organizations in terms of interpreting what these things are. Because even I think going into the dance space, the creative space industry is so accessible, and it's great in terms of everyone can access it. You know, there's so many different ways to create and explore and express in different communities. But actually, again, like you said, like how do these people that create these spaces, these teachers, these whether it be pastors or these people, how do they learn how to hold space for people? When a lot of them are just doing it off grassroots, you know, platforms. But how can we actively build the capacity of these informal leaders to better hold space for the communities they are serving?
Many organisations, and again within dance, I am within dance, you know, dance has been a really, really hard place to navigate, because you do have elements of people who are abusing their authority. Yeah. Been there for years. Yeah. Then it comes into that element of legacy, and well, that person is, you know, an OG in the industry. So therefore, my therefore is therefore what? Yeah. At the end of the day, if they have done something that is wrong and unjust to somebody else, there has to be consequences. Yeah. But that is a very hard navigation for us, and it still is. Still is even now. You have that element of protection. You have that element of silence in a different form for this part, in the sense that, well, we know, we've seen, yet we're not talking on. That becomes a problem. And then what becomes the problem is the victim then, that element of shame, guilt, as we mentioned in the beginning, is amplified for the simple fact that, well, maybe, or their doubt comes in from that person. Maybe I'm overthinking this, or maybe that's not what I've done. No, the one thing that I do want to state is you're validated. You will be validated with ASWA. If it has happened, then that's what it is. And that's how we see it, in order to ensure that safety and ensure that element of being able to be acknowledged. and validated for the way that you feel and the things that has been done. I think that's a really important thing for organisation.
Yeah.
The validation.
Yeah.
You know, there comes these elements of, oh, well, if I do this, then, you know, we're not going to get this funding, or we're not.
Yeah.
That doesn't live up to it. Unfortunately for me.
Yeah.
In the arts, it doesn't.
Yeah.
That's the reality of what we see. And, you know, I'd be living in an absolute different world if I was going to tell you any different at this moment in time, because I'm seeing it. I'm working with it. Mm-hmm. However, we are the ones who are actually saying no, you know, and you can attest to that.
Yeah.
But that grey area is still a problem.
Yeah.
And unless organisations are prepared to go above and beyond and step out of that comfort zone of, well, the law is the law. Okay? We have to take that on board. The law is the law. But there's so many other laws that you've got activists that fight against. You've got people that talk up against.
Yeah.
You've got work that's been done to actually really look at the law and see, well, hold on a second. If this is the statistics, if this is where people do not feel safe, actually, if this is the bulk of, there is ways in which, and it may take time, but there's ways in which we can work with that. And I do believe that organisations really need to hold up and start moving and saying, actually, we do have a problem.
Yeah.
We do have a problem. And start talking out and coming together. It comes back to that coming together again, which is very, very difficult. But I mean, my passion and everything will come out on that. Yeah. I am for that. It needs to come together. Yeah. We need to come together, and we need to work to actually, you know, make that change. Yeah. Because too many of those adolescents within that age bracket, that grey zone, that's the only way I see it. I see things quite, rather than words, I see things in colour. And for me, that's a very grey zone. But the greyness for me in the last year has started to turn to black. And that's a problem for me. That's a problem for me, because then with that is coming a high amount of suicides from the elements of that grey zone. That's a very, 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 very dark place.
But yeah, so 16 is when I started dancing, and that's when I ended up in the situation where I had met someone who was a mentor to my dance teacher. We exchanged details and essentially got into a exploitative relationship. I won't go into too much detail about kind of like what happened or transpired, but essentially I was 16 years old at the time and he was 31. I didn't know his age when we first started talking because he didn't disclose it. And I think the whole relationship was interesting in the sense that I think as a young person, you gain access to the age, you become, of age to consent to sex, but actually I think it's unfair that we allow adult men, adult people, adult women, whoever, adult people to engage with young people that are still legally classified as children. And I think it blows my mind that when we think about child sexual exploitation, we are speaking about young people aged 16 to 18, because oftentimes that age of consent, I think, just opens up a door to actually a big wild forest that actually that 16 to 18 age bracket, there needs to be more protection for that age group, especially when it comes to talking about abuse of power, etc., and these kind of like wider community spaces. I think it was in 2015 that it became illegal for people in powers of responsibility or people in powers of positions of power to have sex with young people under their care, age 16 to 18. I think it was maybe like last year that broadened out to community spaces, to people like dance teachers, to people like driving instructors, etc. But I think around my times, that was maybe like 2011-12, that wasn't that protection available, and I wouldn't have known it was there anyway, because there was no really understanding what was happening anyway. And I think 16 is that age where I'm I can consent now, I am I'm a woman in my eyes, I'm grown, X, Y, and Z, and get into this situation. with someone that, you know, I find interesting. They have so much knowledge. I'm like, wow, so cool. I'm learning so much. Look at me, da, da, da. And I think when we look at child exploitation, there's a point that even the young person may think that they're in a consenting relationship, but actually they are still being exploited. And I think that wasn't something I recognized or realized until I was about 21. For that year-long situation that I was in, I just thought that this is how normal relationships are, adult relationships are, you know. You go through stuff, you know, it's good and bad, you know, you don't really understand. I didn't really understand that actually what was happening was extremely unsafe. There's a lot around abuse of power, how we look at safeguarding in community spaces. And it'll be interesting to kind of like hear your thoughts around that 16 to 18 bracket. And I think that really sensitive timeline when young people have been given, you know, the power to consent to sex, but actually may not have the tools and resources to navigate, you know, consent, sex with adults at that time.
It's a really, really important topic, the 16 to 18-year-old. From working and doing the work at ASWA for the last, 4 years now, majority of the cases that came through were that age bracket. And the problem we have is it's a grey area. And it's a grey area because, yes, in accordance to law, there's an age of consent. However, once it goes outside of a boundary, there is no legal protection for that particular age group. And you mentioned the statistic. That statistic is I think it's higher, if I be honest. Reason why, I remember a particular case that we were taking to the police, and the police turned around and actually said, there's nothing we can do. Or we can do, but there's this process, that process, and that process. And I remember they went through the process. This person was 17, and the process felt for that person, they felt so small, so insignificant.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Due to the fact that from the police's perspective, but you're an adult. So therefore, at what point did you not do, or did you do? And at that point, I remember myself stepping in saying, but no is no. And that's a very simple element for me. No is no. And if it doesn't feel right to the person, then it's not right for the person. But again, that grey area is something whereby we struggle, right? And we struggle from a law perspective. I think something for ASWA that we've done very different is we have ensured our safety and providing that safety for the individuals, but we've also ensured that you're heard and that everybody is heard, irrespective of age, gender, ethnicity, race. It's still very valued. And equally, the consent comes from the individual who is reporting to us. And therefore, if for them it's wrong, if for them they want to action, if for them it's in, everything comes back to that person. And I think that's a really important part of our ethos and what we've wanted to do.
I do think the law needs to change.
Yeah.
Because we're saying that the age of consent for sex is 16, but we're also saying that those are children at the same time. And then you're an adult at 18.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In my previous life, I was also head of safeguarding, working for an organisation called Abianda, who sent us the stories of young women and girls who had experienced criminal exploitation. And as you can imagine, within criminal exploitation, especially in a gender-based violence context, there were so many experiences of sexual trafficking, of sexual exploitation alongside the criminal exploitation. And what I found really frustrating, especially navigating criminal justice systems, social services and statutory services for these young people, that actually the age that was more grey was the 17-year-olds. You've got the conflicting information around age of consent for sex being 16, but you're still a child and still can be under child protection. But then you're 17 and you're in the transitional safeguarding, transitional safeguarding age group, because you're a transitional adult. You're about to become an adult, but you are no longer seen as a child, so you therefore don't get the same protection underneath child protection and support, but then you don't get access to adult protection and support because you're not quite an adult yet. So that bit is the bit, and there's loads of work that's been done around that in the community by like Carleen Firmin, who's done loads of work on contextual safeguarding and thinking about the transitional safeguarding route, there's also another person beginning with a D that I can't remember that wrote a whole report and looking at policies in which to support local authorities and schools within those areas, and education systems within those areas and community spaces to think about the transitional adult safeguarding piece that is missing in that, because it's the law that makes that conflicting, and that is the issue that creates this grey area. It shouldn't be grey. If you're a child, you're a child. You do child things. You're protected under leave child protection. What happens with 17-year-olds, because they're not quite an adult and they're not quite a child? So we need to also clarify that legally. Then there are laws to support and bolster and policies to protect those young people. And then even if you're an adult at the age of 18, making sure that people are able to access the support and the protection within that. Because even if we're thinking somebody's an adult, so therefore they have more agency over consent and what happens to them, when we think about abuse and in the context of abuse, that kind of goes, consent is kind of out of the window in some ways. Because when we look, how many stories and case studies there are of people that have been abused in their 60s. You know, Giselle Piacor, I want to say her name is, phenomenal woman. She's in her 60s, you know. Obviously her story is a bit different because she was drugged. She was drugged, so therefore consent was removed completely. But we need to be thinking about that. Shouldn't be the only, we can see that consent was completely removed. So therefore she deserves justice. There are so many stories similarly to that. Where there has been tools of coercion. Grooming is another way that consent may seem like it's there, but it's not. Actually, because you're being groomed and you're being coerced, you know, using drugs or substances or other ways or physical harm as a way to guys consent from that person. So when we think about abuse and exploitation and violence, I think thinking about what consent actually means, we need to really break that down, because actually it's a lot more nuanced and it's not as it's not as binary as by thinking about a particular age and stage of which something has happened.
I think that 16 to 18 age bracket is kind of like when my situation happened. I think for a lot of young people is when these things happen, and I think it'd be interesting. I think so 16 to 18 is when my experience happened. 18 to 21 I didn't speak about it with anyone, and I kind of like kept silent about everything that happened. 21 is when I then realized that actually something bad had happened, and that actually it could be called grooming, actually it could be called child sexual exploitation. Before I didn't have that language, and it'd be good to hear like what role language and that understanding, that knowledge plays in empowering a person to realize the situation. Because I think even when we talk about, you know, telling a young person you're not to blame, it seems so simple, but actually it speaks to such a deep rooted belief that survivors hold about themselves when it comes to abuse. So
it's a good question, and I think it feeds back to what we said earlier around kind of normalizing some of this language early doors, like, so it becomes normalized around what feels safe, what isn't. So when we are in our late teens or we are in our early 20s, we've got some basic understanding around what feels wrong. And I don't know whether this will ever change until society changes, like that embodied feeling of shame and pain and guilt. And for the survivor, I don't know when that will shift, to be honest, because also there's been harm that's happened, there's been violence that's happened, and that's going to have an impact on an embodied sense. So I think maybe starting those conversations a lot earlier, normalizing, creating those safer spaces.
And I think actually, as we're drawing to a close, I think also your point on support, I think, in obviously in 2020, I made my disclosure of what happened to me at 16 to 17. And I think both of you were hugely instrumental in guiding me through that disclosure process. It was a public disclosure. I think, you know, the Me Too movement was happening online, and I just like I think Twitter triggered the life out of me, and I made my my open disclosure. And I think at first there was like a lot of support through that process, and then afterwards mentally the weight of it became a lot, because I think with disclosures and being a survivor disclosing, you're not just disclosing against this person, you're disclosing actually, like you said, against a whole organization, a whole system, a whole family perhaps, you know what I mean, or just a big machine. And I think actually that support is so important. Yeah, you know, you let me come and stay at your house and, you know, walks me through my journey and how I got to where I am, to making that disclosure. Nadia, you offered me legal support, therapeutic support, kind of like through that process. And I think actually having the both of you genuinely saved my life, because I think at that time I've never experienced gut-wrenching anxiety in my life except for the first time in those instances. And I think without having that support, I think it's so hard for people to get over something like that, or to even go through that process. And so as we're drawing to an end, I would love to ask you guys for two pieces of advice that you would give. One, to a survivor who is navigating their own survival journey, and one to the wider organizations, systems, of how they can better be of support to a survivor. I know one is not enough, but one each is not enough. But yeah,
You know, when you close your eyes and think one. You know, for me.
Oh no, you said so I thought you were gonna
I was
speak.
like just thinking
okay.
my moment.
Yeah.
I'm happy to go then. First off, just thank you for trusting us to witness you during that time.
Thank you.
And I think that's also something that speaks to what I'm going to say around survivors. The story that you have and what has happened to you, first off, is not your fault. It never is, regardless of the situation. It's not your fault. But also the story that you have, whoever you trust to tell someone with, it's a privilege that they hear that story. It's a privilege for someone to witness that story. It's not a burden that you're going to bring into somebody else's life. It's a privilege. And so my point to my I guess my one thing to say to survivors is that it's really important that you have space to be witnessed. Mm-hmm. And whether that's with a therapist, whether that's with somebody that you can trust with this story that can hold that for you, is really important. Whether that's in a group space, like at Our Naked Truths, we have had so many disclosures. Mm-hmm. In 8 years, we have had so many disclosures because of the power of being witnessed in community and knowing that you'll be heard and held and seen. So finding that space, wherever it is, where you can be heard and witnessed and know that you'll be held, is incredibly important. Knowing that your story is a privilege that you're giving to someone else, inviting them into your experience. And then secondly, to organizations, I think there's so many things, systemically, legally, all of those things. But I think one thing that I think is important is that organizations who are operating in this space need to be survivor-centered. Mm. And we think about the survivor's story, we're thinking about it from an intersectional aspect, from a cultural aspect, from a legal aspect, from an intergenerational aspect, and the context in which that survivor is coming to you with. It's so important that your approach is tailored to meet those needs. And I know for some organizations that have small resources, that might be hard to do, but there's always benefits of partnering up with other organizations in that space, learning. There are so many resources out there. But I think it's really important to be survivor-centered, being realistic and honest about what can be achieved, and making sure that the advocacy is tailored around the survivor.
Thank you.
And I think powerful points, they are really, and I second them all. I also want to thank you though, Elsie, as well, because for me, you're a powerful individual in many ways, okay? And your story, your presence, the education that you are also giving to others as a platform, it's priceless. It's priceless. So I want to also thank you and commend you for being that strength.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And for sharing, for being vulnerable. It's not easy. And I think that leads on to one thing, maybe, that for me, it is listen to your body, survivors, listen to your body, and survivors, victims, listen to your body. Survivors, and if within your body it's not feeling right and you are saying, no, I want to speak. Mm-hmm. Speak. Mm-hmm. Don't be afraid. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the most purest thing I can say. And it's really difficult, and I understand and I empathise that it is. Mm-hmm. But there are the likes of us who are out here who want to hold and support and signpost if needed, you know. So listen to that, and it doesn't matter the time. That's also a really important aspect. Irrespective of the time, open and come and speak to us, you know. For organisations, I think the one thing for me is stop closing the doors. Stop closing those doors. At the end of the day, if you are put in a place to offer a service, to offer support, then go above and beyond to do that. And I'm trying to stay positive with my thought process with that, because I do see that many organisations, not all, but some just have this tick box, and the tick boxes aren't working. You need to go above and beyond that. And above and beyond that, you will know what you need to do. But it is keeping those doors open, keeping them alive, and allowing for others to feel safe to come in to your organisation. If as an organisation you are not, though, allowing safety, then don't do it. And that's the one thing that I have to really put out there.
Well, guys, 1 hour is not enough, and I think everything we've discussed today could have its own series on it alone. But thank you guys for joining me in this conversation. And to everyone that's listening, hopefully this has been useful. Hopefully this has been helpful. Hopefully it's resonated. And yeah, as two lovely ladies have mentioned, if you are in need of support, make sure that you go out and seek it. Because the sooner you do get support, the sooner you get help, and your life changes and things get better. But the first step is, believing that you are worthy of support, and that you get the tools to kind of like get that support. So yeah, thank you guys for listening. Thanks.
You're so amazing.
You're so amazing. Can I do my intro quickly again?
Yeah, sure.
So sorry. Hi everyone. My name is Elsie Ayotunde Cullen, and I'm the founder of a platform called Our Peoples. And today we have another episode of Our People's Heart Conversations, where we speak about topics that are important and impactful for us. Today we are speaking about sexual abuse and child sexual exploitation. It's a topic that's really dear to my heart. And with me, I have two amazing guests who I think have been pivotal in my journey over the last few years, since 2020, when I made my big public disclosure about what happened to me over the years. And I think for me, it's really important to bring these two women back to speak about not only the situation that happened, but also I think just the whole journey, because they're really informative, really knowledgeable, and hopefully this will be a conversation that is useful not only to people that have experienced sexual abuse or child exploitation, but also to organisations and wider bodies that are working with people in general who may have survivors in their midst. And so, yeah, let me introduce the lovely ladies. Lovely ladies, do you want to introduce yourself? Okay, thank you. Done.